We all need some sort of social interaction.
Greetings, all, and welcome to Cochise Convos, a podcast dedicated to sharing your stories and information about Cochise College. This is episode 17 of Cochise Convos Quarantine Edition, where we'll be listening to your stories as Cochise College students and alumni and how you've managed to adjust during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, my guest is Summer Hom, who's been the host of Cochise Convos for the past few months, and she'll be sharing her experience managing school and doing the podcast while in lockdown. Summer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Alan. I'm excited to be here.
So, in general, how was the quarantine for you? Were you quarantined with anyone or were you by yourself?
The quarantine was interesting, to say the least. I was quarantined with my family, so my mom, my brother, and my parents, and my doc hound Ziggy. But yeah, it was a little bit of a roller coaster ride, but overall, it was very enlightening.
So, when you were talking about how it was kind of like a roller coaster ride and how it was somewhat enlightening, what were the aspects of being in lockdown that were enlightening to you, and what were the challenges of the lockdown in general for you as a student?
One of the enlightening factors was I realized how much of an introvert I am. I thought I was more of like an ambivert, and because I really thrived off having that social interaction. And of course, it's necessary, but I realized how I kind of liked how I could just focus on my studies and still socialize from a distance. But that was something I was not expecting to learn about myself. Uh, was that? But
So, how
it's
was the
definitely interesting.
So how was the transition to going to the online format? Was it something that was relatively smooth for you, or was it something that took a little bit of adjusting?
It was relatively smooth. Um, I got lucky that I've had some experience with taking a few online courses, so the structure was not anything that was new to me. It was a little bit challenging because the two classes I was taking at the time really thrived off of that classroom interaction, especially amongst our peers, and not having that in the same sense was a little bit challenging and a little awkward. And you definitely didn't feel the same way as you did with an in-person class. It was a little harder to feel motivated to work on our assignments when we didn't really have I got to get this done before Thursday at 8:30 because I have to go to class and have to submit my thing and talk about it. So it was a little challenging self-motivation wise, but otherwise it wasn't too bad. I got lucky in some ways that both my classes transitioned pretty smoothly to online and that there really wasn't too many hiccups.
So when you talked about motivation, what was how did you stay motivated? Because for me myself, I find it sometimes extremely like difficult to like transition from going from like face-to-face classes where you have that transition mentally in your mind of leaving your house, which is your comfortable space, and going to more of a educational environment where you're more the listener instead of everything at home.
Mhm.
So how was that like for you?
It was hard because I made a very common mistake of having both everything I was doing for school and also I was very fortunate that my job at the time was able to be worked remotely from home, and I did everything in one space, and which also was the same space I slept in, which is my room. So I did homework in my room, I did work in my room, and I read books and had in my free time I would relax also in there too. And I think the problem with that is that you can't really switch gears between what you're doing. I guess that makes sense in your head. One thing I tried to do to help combat that is I tried to have separate spaces in my home where I would do these different tasks. I tried to move my workspace out into our living room. And that way, when I would walk in there, be like, okay, I'm going to get ready to go to work now. I try to keep my homework at our kitchen table. And then that way, my room could just be a place where I could relax. So that helped. And then I also tried to keep the effort to get dressed every morning because oddly enough, because if I'm in my pajamas doing stuff, it's very comfortable, but it's like I feel tired and lethargic and I don't want to do anything. So that's kind of what I did to help me transition myself like, okay, we're starting the day and we're going to get work done. But it was a little rocky at first. And, the pathway was kind of like this. Sometimes I'd be like, yeah, I'm super productive. And then I would, have another downhill slope, like when finals would come or, things were challenging at the time. But overall, I think that's the two main things that I worked on that helped me delineate, okay, what activities I'm doing and to help keep some level of motivation up, although it was challenging.
So, Summer, you are the first liberal arts and journalism major here on the show. Well, technically, you've always been a part of the show, but this is kind of the first time we're kind of learning about you. So, can you describe what aspects of journalism that you found most inspirational, especially when you were starting to do a project like this?
I'll have to go look up and see who had this quote. My journalism teacher actually mentioned this, that I think it was a New York Times publisher, but I'll have to go double check. But he mentioned that journalism, and more specifically news, is the first rough draft of history. And I've always loved that quote. And I think that's something that really holds true. You're documenting what's going on at the time, and very much often it's referenced in our history books in the future. And I think that's something that's important to maintain and to keep going. But I think that's my favorite aspect, is that you get to document what happens. From there, you really get to get a feel of what it was like at the time.
So, with that in mind, what was the primary inspiration to Coach's Convos? Why did you decide to do this project?
No one was really talking about college students. And again, this was at the time, it was fairly early on, and um, all of us were kind of struggling to just get a grasp on what was going on. But I noticed that there really wasn't anything on college students. And I thought that really needed to be shown in our media coverage. And college is this really interesting transient time where you're transitioning from being a student and also being a professional. And in many ways, you wear multiple hats, especially if you're working a job and going to school, or if you get an internship and you're also at school. You're kind of straddling these two different worlds. And with the pandemic, it definitely adds another layer of complexity to that to that life. And especially for college students who are living in the dorms, many of them had to go find other housing arrangements when many of the states in our country inflicted lockdown orders, schools closed down. So they had to quickly figure out, hey, where am I going to live? Some of the non-traditional students would had to figure out different housing arrangements. Students who are living in dorms had to figure that out. I was very fortunate that I was still able to live at home with my family, but I know of many people who were not so fortunate and had to really scramble to find out, hey, where am I going to live? How am I going to continue my schoolwork? Most of our schoolwork nowadays, I can speak for Cochise College, we transitioned to a online format for a few months. And for some students, they didn't have their own computers and or a stable internet connection to be able to complete their assignments. And it was that struggle and that transition that I really wanted to capture, because I think it's important to note how we got through this time, because this is probably not going to be the only pandemic. It's definitely not the last. And I think it's important we note and document how we handled it and how different people with different situations handled it. The second motivation was, at the time I was thinking about making a major change, both literally and figuratively. I was initially majoring in elementary education, and I switched over to physics, and neither field, I had interests in each of those fields, but none of them really fit. And I thought, well, I'd like to give journalism a try. And podcasts are kind of a unique medium. They're starting to rise in popularity. And I thought, well, I'd like to have my hand and try that, because it would give me practice interviewing people and trying to really understand who they are as people. And I thought, well, this might be a good way to kind of dip my toe in the water and see if I liked it.
So, what were some of the things that you learned from doing the podcast?
That no matter how introverted or extroverted you are, or ambiverted, whatever end of the spectrum you reside, we all need some sort of social interaction. I think that's one thing that every person I've interviewed on the show has cited, is that they have felt massive energy withdrawals from not being able to interact with people. And I've had people who are very extroverted on the show say that, oh my gosh, I can't, this is hard because I don't have that same energy exchange from interacting with people. For them, that's how they gain that energy and that fulfillment. And I had people on the show who were very introverted and who said, I never really liked or really felt like I needed that interaction before. And now I'm realizing I really do. So, and I had people who were ambiverted who were like, yeah, this feels really weird. And I kind of miss people, but the solitude is nice too. But, so there was a lot of different factors, but people really, I was just surprised how much everyone across the board was like, I really need that social interaction to feel some level of sanity, but also some level of fulfillment.
Was there a particular favorite moment you had while recording Coaches Convos?
Ooh, that's hard. There were moments from every episode that were very special. I think what I wanted to really highlight was how the power of how diverse our student body is and how everyone from their backgrounds, we have I tried to integrate a good mix of people who were non-traditional students, people who were traditional students, and everyone in between. And one of my favorite moments was actually on episode 8 with Devin Williams. I asked him, and I asked this question for all my guests, what advice would you give to someone who's struggling with their academics in quarantine? And I love how he just sat there for a moment and thought, and just said, study. I thought that was absolutely great because it's so true. If you're struggling, you got to do your homework and you've got to find ways to kind of help yourself. I think that's one thing about college that's really hard to adjust to, is that when you're struggling on something, you have to be your own advocate and say, hey, I need help. And then in the quarantine, even more so, because we had less access to some of the resources that we normally would have on campus. And they did a great job of trying to integrate those so they'd be available online, but you still have to take the initiative to ask for help. That was one of my favorite moments. That made me crack up pretty bad. It was a funny moment and I really enjoyed that. I remember another episode, I think it was the second episode of Coaches Convos, where Athena Reynolds was mentioning how I think it was the month of April she was talking about just flew by. And she described it. She's like, oh my gosh, I was like, I gotta figure things out. And she was describing with her hands. And I thought that was just hilarious because that's how we all felt. It was a great symbolism of, the mad rush we're all trying to do to get everything done. But I think those were my two favorite moments, just because it really epitomized in the best way and in the most authentic way some really salient points and some good advice for people, and also in a way that is relatable, because it's all kind of that community, about that community building, hey, I'm struggling too, but here's how I did it. And getting to share those experiences, I think, is what really made my day, was getting to hear how different people made their points relatable. It was really, really fun to watch and to witness.
So Summer, thank you so much for joining us here today for this special episode of Coaches Convos. I do have one more question for you before we end today. For anyone, you were mentioning how you were interested in starting a podcast. For those who were in your similar position, who want to start a podcast of their own, do you have any advice for them?
I think the first bit I would say is have a direction and a theme that you want to base it off of. For me, I wanted to harken off the theme of, hey, let's talk to college students, specifically at Cochise College, and see how they adjusted to the quarantine. I think if you have a direct theme and a focus of what you're wanting to cover and what you want to talk about, I think that's really helpful, because it makes drafting your questions and easier. And then, of course, assembling your sample group, your sample size, it makes it smaller, more focused, so that way it's not so overwhelming. I would also recommend that, explore your different options. There's multiple platforms that you can record a podcast off of and do it in a remote setting. For our podcast, I use Zoom. But I know there's several other platforms out there. So definitely explore your options, see which ones you like best. And I think the last bit of advice I would say is to have fun with it. Podcasts are kind of a nice medium to really dive into, because as far as production, they're fairly simple to make with today's technology and software. But they're also kind of that nice branch between a casual conversation and a more structured journalism interview. They're kind of like the happy medium of those two things. So it's really fun, the things you get to learn, and but mainly just have fun with it, explore, and really just enjoy the experience because it's hearing people's stories is really powerful. And especially when you get to find out something you maybe didn't know going into it. But really just have fun with it.
And we also wanted to give a special shout out to Hassan Khan, who has been the one editing Coaches Convos for the past few episodes. So we wanted to give them a nice little shout out. So thank you so much for your efforts. We greatly appreciate it. And Summer, is there any final remarks that you would like to add to end this season of Coaches Convos?
Ooh, I would love to say thank you to everyone who's been watching all the episodes and supporting the podcast over the last few months. It's been really a joy and a pleasure to be able to create it. I also would love to thank all of my guests. You guys really made the show with your authenticity, and the vibrancy you brought to the show is really what has made it. So thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. Yeah, but a giant thank you to everyone who's been involved. The marketing department at the college, who has been helping us upload these episodes to the channel. I'm really grateful that I was able to have that experience and to be able to share it and involve everyone. I think that has been really powerful. So a huge giant thank you.
And again, thank you all so much for watching. If you want to see previous episodes of Coaches Convos, you can go and to our YouTube channel and you can subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. And of course, there's a bell button there. So if you click that, you get post notifications. So you get buzzed every time we post. And of course, we have other social medias as well, along as like Facebook and then Instagram. Make sure you guys go check those out. Thank you guys so much again for watching. Thank you, Summer, for hosting a wonderful podcast. We hope you guys have a wonderful holiday season. Have a good one, everyone.
Thanks.
Greetings all and welcome to Coaches Convos, a podcast dedicated to sharing your stories and information about Coaches College. This is episode 17 of Coaches Convos Quarantine Edition, where we'll be listening to your stories as Coaches College students and alumni and how you've managed to adjust during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, my guest is Summer Ham, who's been the host of Coaches Convos for the past few months, and she'll be sharing her experience managing school and doing the podcast all while during the lockdown. That was an awkward sentence. I'm gonna do it again.
Oh, it was going so well.
It was. I was like, I forgot the episode number. I'm gonna put that down here.
No, you're good.
Sorry,
I was wondering it because I know she didn't put it down. Like, I wonder if he's gonna remember which episode.
I know, and I was slipping out. This is episode 17 of Coaches Convos Quarantine Edition, where we'll be listening to your stories as Coaches College students and alumni. I forgot because it's not in the scripture, so I was like, while in lockdown.
Wow,
That's like we're on the borderline of a run-on sentence, but you know what? You just
no one's looking at your script but you.
Okay, here we go. Greetings all and welcome to Coaches Convos, a podcast dedicated to sharing your stories and information about Coaches College. This is episode 17 of Coaches Convos Quarantine Edition, where we'll be listening to your stories as Coaches College students and alumni and how you've managed to adjust during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, my guest is Summer Ham, who's been the host of Coaches Convos for the past few months, and she'll be sharing her experience in managing school. Okay.
School.
Okay, you know what? I got this. Go on in again, rapid fire.
You tease me for being too meticulous, but this is why I write everything down.
Listen. You need the organic feel. All right. Son, if you end up editing this, you're going to have to put this as the bloopers at the end. So